This weekend, the latest MCU film, Eternals, hits theaters, so today I'm going to do something just a little bit different, an MCU tier ranking. Hi, my name is Sean, and I love to talk about movies way too much. With that in mind, go ahead and join me down below in the comments section. Share your tier ranking of the MCU. What categories do you put each of the movies into? My tier ranking isn't the right tier ranking, it's just my ranking, and I would love to see yours. Also, down below in the description, I did include a link to the tier maker that I used. If you want to create your own, share it on social media and tag me. I'd love to see some of your rankings, and let's get started. And we're going to go through these in release order. So we're starting with Iron Man, and let's cut right to the chase. I think they started off with one of their best. Iron Man is a top tier MCU film for me. It doesn't have all the spectacle and razzle dazzle of the later MCU films, and that's kind of what makes it stand out. It's able to tell a straightforward story about a man who has this redemptive arc where he discovers the error of his ways and tries to be a better person.
You're gonna kill yourself, Tony. I'm not gonna be a part of it.
I shouldn't be alive. Unless it was for a reason. I just finally know what I have to do.
And in doing so, it's also able to lay the groundwork for this fantastic franchise. The casting is amazing. The dialogue is snappy and it pops. It has all the stuff I love about the MCU without necessarily all the baggage of later MCU films. So for me, it might be one of the smaller films in the franchise, but it's one of the best. Then a month later, we got The Incredible Hulk. Now, this movie is a lot like the black sheep of the MCU. It's the only film that was distributed by Universal, so it's got a little bit of a different flavor to it. It's not as fun and funny. The tone is certainly different. So a lot of people have this as one of the absolute worst MCU films. I do not think that this movie is bottom tier. I think it does have a lot to offer if you take it on its own terms. I like Edward Norton in the lead role. I did watch the old Incredible Hulk TV show when I was growing up, and so maybe that kind of taints my perspective just a little bit, but this is a nice homage to that I think even as we've moved through the MCU, they have done some callback to this film with Thunderbolt Ross. Abomination is coming back. So for me, it's not a great MCU film, but I do think it's enjoyable, but flawed. The third MCU film was Iron Man 2, and when this movie first came out, I actually really enjoyed it. Just the novelty of more of Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man was enough for me to just have an absolute blast with this film when it first came out. But as he appeared in many more films as Iron Man, the novelty of that wore off, and then you're just left with the story, the script that they had for this film, and I think that this was an underdeveloped, undercooked film that was rushed into production because they wanted to be able to do all the setup films to get to an Avengers release date that they had set in mind, and with proper perspective, I think this is a bottom tier film in the MCU. There are some cool action sequences, though not nearly enough of them. There are some funny moments because Robert Downey Jr. has amazing charisma. But on a story level, storytelling, it's a very flawed film with the way they put it together. In fact, I did a video on how to fix Iron Man 2 with my suggestions on what might have made for a better film. You can check that out right up here if I remember to put a card there. But as is, bottom tier. Moving right along, we have Thor. Now, this is a movie that's pretty frustrating for me because it gets a lot of things right. The casting here, amazing. At the time this came out, Chris Hemsworth, Tom Hiddleston, these were nobodies, and they just found the perfect people for these roles that we now love and can't imagine anyone else in those parts. Some of the fish out of water humor, I think, just lands wonderfully.
I like it.
I know, it's great, right?
Another!
But it's also a film that I don't think balances its tones quite right. There's supposed to be a pretty jarring shift when you go from Asgard down to Earth, but I think it makes for a bit of an incohesive film with the way that it plays out. And I think there's also a bit of a villain problem in the film of, while Loki is the villain, there's not a threat that our hero is actively trying to defeat throughout the runtime until he learns about the villain threat right before it happens. He's more on his personal journey, and so it makes for a film that kind of lacks a sense of urgency to it. So it's enjoyable, but it's flawed. Next up, Captain America, the First Avenger. And for me, there's so many things about this movie that I absolutely love. The score is one of the absolute best in the MCU. The production design with the way that these cars have this distinct look to them, the cameras that Joe Johnston used to picture or to photograph the film, I think it has a distinct look to it in a way that most MCU films don't. Once again, fantastic casting of Chris Evans, and I love the Steve Rogers origin story in this film. Does, I think, lose a little bit of steam once he becomes Captain America and has to montage through World War II. But overall, this is a very enjoyable film for me that I think does a great job of setting up a bunch of things for the MCU and for these characters. That'll bring us to our final film of Phase 1 with the Avengers, and let's get right to it. This is a top tier film for me. When it came out, this was actually a big risk, the idea of taking all these different franchises with different tones and combining them together in a team-up movie. That just hadn't really been done before on this scale. I was nervous about it even because Joss Whedon was writing and directing it. As a Joss Whedon fan, I wasn't sure if he was ready for this sort of project. Then I watched the movie, and to this day, I think it has some of the best banter amongst the team. The third act just puts such a big, gigantic grin on your face. It's a fairly simplistic setup, but because it's the first time we've done something like this, it works to just have a good old-fashioned story about heroes coming together to battle back an invading army, and they've balanced in that third act, giving everyone an awesome moment to stand out, to do something heroic, and just be awesome as superheroes. So this was a special movie when it came out, and rewatching it, it still puts such a grin on my face by the time the credits roll. Kicking off Phase 2 is Iron Man 3. And this is another one that gets very frustrating because if you just take it as a subversive Shane Black action movie, comic book film, I think it works really well. It's just very odd as an MCU film. But Shane Black's writing style, his dialogue fits perfectly with Robert Downey Jr.'s delivery, in particular as you get into the banter with him and the kid. Likewise, Shane Black can deliver on action sequences, but at the same time, they do this Mandarin twist in the movie where they take this villain that feels menacing and sinister in an interesting way, and they subvert our expectations in a way where they deliver Killian, who is significantly less interesting, much more generic. It seemed like they kind of sabotaged their own film. In and of itself, a movie that does a lot of things that I really like, but just fits really weird into the MCU, even where the film ends, is undone soon afterwards when we get to Age of Ultron. So it's fun, it's enjoyable, but it's flawed. Next up, Thor: The Dark World. The way the universe played out, this is the only MCU film that I didn't see in the theater when it first came out, and I guess I haven't seen it since then either, so it's the only MCU film I haven't seen in the theater. And as you can probably guess, this is a bottom tier MCU film for me. It's just so bland and forgettable and lacking anything distinct, which is strange because it has a bunch of information about Infinity Stones that's important. It sets up a bunch of things that are coming in the future. We get a fake death of Loki, but the actual effect of watching the film doesn't really pull out any big emotions from me. It's a movie where the plot is actually a little bit confusing. The villains are utterly forgettable. Malekith does not have one distinct personality trait about him. He's just an evil dark elf that really wants the ether. And so a movie that it's in focus, it's professionally acted, it has stunning state-of-the-art special effects, everything is professionally done. There's just nothing about it that's interesting. Then we have Captain America: The Winter Soldier, one of the films in the MCU that is widely regarded as the best film in the MCU. For me, I'm gonna call it great, but I don't have it as a top tier MCU film. And it doesn't do anything wrong. I think it's I love the way that it combines the MCU with a political thriller. I love that it has kind of more mature themes inside of it. The action is choreographed in a way that makes it exciting and visceral, in particular the elevator sequence. It's a movie that I thoroughly enjoy. I think it's great, but it doesn't pull out those big, gigantic emotions that my top tier films pull out of me. Some of that is a matter of taste. We're all wired just a little bit differently, and so we kind of resonate with things in different ways. So I know the fact that I don't have in the top tier will step on some of your toes. Sorry, I'm just wired a little bit differently. It's a great film. I love this film. I just love some other ones more. Speaking of movies that we are wired for, that'll bring us to Guardians of the Galaxy. And this movie was one of the most pleasant surprises I have ever had in a movie theater. Now, I was excited for it because I love sci-fi and I love the MCU, but I didn't know who these characters were. When they announced that they were doing a Guardians of the Galaxy film in 2012, I was like, what on earth are they doing? What is this gamble that they're taking? Who are these characters? Why is this your follow-up to the Avengers? And I went and saw the movie, and I instantly fell in love with it. This is a top-tier MCU film for me, and so much of that is that James Gunn just poured his heart and soul into these characters and developed all these distinct personalities that go together so well. They're fun as individuals, but they're even better together. And it just tells this story that just feels so personal while being massive in scale and size at the same time. It has a soundtrack that, just like the film itself, has so much heart to it that you can tell that these are songs that he loved, and that's just a piece that he put into the movie of what he loves in the film as this distinct characteristic tied to Star-Lord. And it just, everything in the movie oozes personality. And so it's, to me, one of those ones that I loved it right out of the gate. Without question, top tier and a personal favorite. That'll bring us to our second Avengers film, Age of Ultron. And I gotta go with this one. It's enjoyable, but it is flawed. It's a movie that tries to outdo everything in the first movie, and there's more characters, there's more backstory. It's setting up phase 3. And the individual sequences can be just as exciting as the first movie. The individual lines of dialogue can be just as good, but there's just so much in here that it's a film that it doesn't deliver quite on its ambitions. It's also, I would say, probably the most confusing film in the MCU, where there's always this balance in storytelling of, do you say too much, too little? In this movie, it feels like things happen before they explain what it means. And so you have all this stuff happening at the beginning with them on this mission immediately, and Tony picks up the staff, and then you see the twins watching him, and you don't understand what any of that means until several sequences later. It's just a very odd way to tell the story. It's well known that this movie was originally longer and they had to trim it back, and I think you see that a little bit in the final result. And so I do enjoy this film, but it's also very clearly flawed. And the final film of Phase 2, Ant-Man. And I have always had fun with this film. It's just a nice change of pace. Some of the MCU films are these big, gigantic Avengers films with enormous casts, huge stakes. And then you have the Ant-Man films that are very small in scale intentionally, and they're about committing heists. Or the second one's a MacGuffin story, and I love that about them. They're also very much comedies that lean into the dialogue, the banter between the characters. They got the perfect character or actor to play Scott Lang with Paul Rudd, who's just so instantly likable and seems so unlikely as a hero, and that fits the character. That he's not setting out to be a hero, he just gets swept up in it, wants to do the right thing, and he nails that perfectly. I love that Michael Douglas is in this film. So for me, this one is very enjoyable. It's not swinging for the fences, it's not trying to be the best MCU film with the biggest stakes, with the most emotion, but it's a solid, enjoyable ride.
Ants.
Moving right along, we are to Captain America Civil War, or Avengers 2.5. And To me, this is a top-tier MCU film. What this movie does so well is that it's a direct sequel to Age of Ultron and Winter Soldier while pulling all of these characters together and setting up multiple sequels seamlessly. A big piece of that is that as you go into this movie, the central conflict comes from the very different journeys that Steve and Tony have been on. Their worldviews, their flaws are different, and that's where the central conflict comes from. And because of that, 5 years later, we can still debate who was right, Steve or Tony. Are you Team Steve or are you Team Tony? Let me know down below in the comment section. Of course, it's just a comic book fan's dream come true with that airport sequence with it's like all your toys playing on the playground together. And you finally got to see that in cinema form. And then you get to the third act and you get a very personal, heartbreaking fight because you're watching a friendship disintegrate and the Avengers fall apart in light of where the MCU goes. Because of the fallout from this movie, Thanos won. Moving right along, Doctor Strange. Now, this is another one that's a little bit frustrating because, on the one hand, visually speaking, I think this movie has the most interesting visual effects. Now, all of the MCU films are jam-packed with tons of CGI, but this is the one that has like artistic CGI, where when they start going into these different realms, it's like kaleidoscope reality. It's taking Inception and doing it on steroids and throwing in a bunch of Dark City into the mix. The script itself wasn't interesting though. Visually, it's interesting. Their powers are interesting. The script feels like they took the Doctor Strange mythology, squished it into the basic boilerplate MCU template for how you do an origin story, and you just feel them just mashing it in all the proper beats that are supposed to be there leading up to a big gigantic CGI fight in the third act. Of all the movies here, I think this is the one where I feel the MCU formula and template the most. So for me, this movie, it is enjoyable, but it is flawed. That will bring us to Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. Now, if you're familiar with my channel, you probably have a pretty good guess where I'm going to put this movie in the history of my channel. My opinion on Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 is by far the opinion where I've gotten the most dislikes, the most angry comments, and the most people disagreeing with me. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, for me, it is bottom tier. I did not like what James Gunn did with the sequel. Every time I watch it, something new frustrates me about the story that he chose to tell and how he chose to tell that story. A lot of elements in this movie put a bad taste in my mouth with both how mean-spirited Drax is towards Mantis, the nature of the plotline involving Ego killing Star-Lord's family, and the movie kind of shrugs it off. He gets mad about his mother being killed, but it overlooks Ego killed thousands of his own children. There were Star-Lord siblings, and the movie just doesn't really even address that. And then right after Star-Lord has his heart ripped out that this father he's been looking for his entire life, he's found him, and then only to discover that his father killed his mother. And then it cuts to a David Hasselhoff joke, undermining the dramatic tension of the moment. And so for me, this is a movie that it breaks my heart that I don't like this movie. But as it is, I do not like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 as a whole. But I do like the next MCU film, SpiderMan Homecoming, and I thought that this was just such a charming, endearing new addition to the MCU that while there was a lot of movies in the franchise up to this point in time, they still managed to find some new angle to explore this world, and that's by telling a story in the MCU from the perspective of a high schooler. He's immature, but he wants to do the right thing, and there's something in that that's just a lot of fun. So for me, this one is great. Not quite top tier, but it is great. And I would say this one might be one of the most rewatchable films in the MCU. It's just very easy to put on, have fun with. It's fun, it's funny. The cast have great chemistry. I love the Vulture as a villain because he's not this guy that's out trying to blow up the city. He's just a guy that's made a series of bad choices because he felt wronged, and he's turned into a villain because of it. He's doing terrible things because of it. But it was all this slow trajectory to get him there. And so for me, this is a great MCU film that's very easy to rewatch. Speaking of movies in the great category, Thor Ragnarok. This is another one that I'm just going to throw right there in the great category. After Thor the Dark World, I guess they decided they needed to rework this franchise a little bit. They brought in this guy named Taika Waititi, who just brought in so much energy into this franchise, reworked the character a little bit, changed the tone dramatically, changed the look of the franchise dramatically, and made what might be the funniest movie in the entire MCU. Chris Hemsworth is known for looking like a Norse god, but he's also a very funny person. I think he has amazing comedic timing, and this movie just puts that on display, puts it front and center. But everyone else is really funny. The music is fun, whether you're talking about the use of Led Zeppelin or you're talking about the score. The color palette is vibrant. It's just a nice burst of energy into the MCU. Maybe it leads a little bit too much into self-parody at times. A couple of times I think it undermines some dramatic moments for the sake of a joke, but it is so entertaining. I think it's great. And then we got a three-peat of greatness. Black Panther also going right there in the great category. This might be the most mature and thematically rich film in the entire MCU, where it tells the story of a king and his kingdom, where as you're going through this story, it has some gigantic twists and turns where you're not quite sure where this is headed, and you really take T'Challa on a journey where he grows as a king. He is transformed by his encounter with the villain. In fact, the villain somewhat wins the moral argument, but he's doing villainous things. So T'Challa has to change to do the right thing in the big picture and defeat the villain. So I just think it's able to accomplish a lot of things. Now, I did think as an action movie, it's not a very good action movie. It's kind of subpar with the CGI, the handling of the action sequence. Some of them get a little bit goofy at times. And so I don't think it fully is in that top tier for me. But overall, it's a great story that has a lot of weight to it. Next up, Avengers Infinity War. And I think these 4 films in a row are probably the best run in the entire MCU, because I'm going to put this one in the top tier. I absolutely love Avengers Infinity War and everything they were able to do with this film. I love seeing all these characters come together and having Doctor Strange and Tony Stark using their wits against one another. And beyond that, you get a fantastic villain in Thanos, and they really spend time developing him, giving him a backstory, and giving him motivation that doesn't just make him this cardboard cutout that wants to do something crazy. And it's a movie where the heroes lose. And in the MCU that normally goes for happy endings and lots of jokes, this is a movie where the heroes lose and the stakes are catastrophic. It has everything that I love about the MCU in one film. No question, no debate. This is in the top tier for me. From there, the MCU goes with a pendulum swing with Ant-Man and the Wasp. We go from the biggest film the MCU has ever delivered to one of the most small-scale films the MCU has ever delivered with Ant-Man and the Wasp. That's a simple MacGuffin story with villains that aren't really trying to kill anyone. They just want some technology to make some money. At the core of the objective of our heroes, it's to save a person that at the beginning of the film they thought was dead anyway. It's small scale, and that's exactly why I like it. It's a change of pace that's not trying to outdo all the other films. It's just a fun, light, breezy MacGuffin story about everyone trying to get this one briefcase building with a bunch of technology in it. So you get some simple heists, a lot of joke setups. So for me, it's not swinging like the first Ant-Man. It's not swinging for the fences, and it certainly doesn't hit a home run, but is absolutely a very enjoyable film for me. That'll bring us to Captain Marvel, and I'll say this before I give my placement of this one. This movie is not in my bottom 3, but I do think it is bottom tier.
Is that like a personal attack or something?
I think there are some enjoyable elements about this, in particular, getting to spend time with a bunch of young Nick Fury, before he's cynical, before he knows the depths of the weirdness of the universe, seeing Samuel L. Jackson getting to just do his thing with all his charisma. I had a lot of fun with that. There's some little elements in the middle of the film that felt a bit like the X-Files. I thought that was a good bit of fun. There's definitely some jokes that worked for me. The story overall, I think, has some flaws in the flow of the logic, the way that it plays out, and just a lot of awkwardness with the Central Intelligence, bringing back Ronan the Accuser just to once again have him be a forgettable villain. And then Captain Marvel herself is written to be kind of at arm's length from the audience. She doesn't have her memory, so she's responding basically to what everyone is telling her to be. And so she's just not a very good central character in a film like this. And so I don't think it's at the absolute bottom, but it is bottom tier. But on the opposite end of the spectrum, we've got Avengers Endgame that to me absolutely is top tier MCU. When I first watched this movie, I had a few kind of issues with it. I really didn't like Thor Bowski. I thought he played a little bit too much like an SNL parody rather than a serious exploration. But the reality is, the last hour of this film is the most joy-inducing, stand-up and cheer fan service ever put to film. It is just such a phenomenal example of what you can do with long-form storytelling, where you spend a long time telling a story, developing a lot of characters, and then you pay it off with one fantastic final showdown. I don't know if anything can top that last hour. And that's not even as, like, the rest of the movie is really good too. The first hour is this exploration of the different ways that people deal with tragedy and depression. But man, that last hour, like, legitimately, when my family's rewatching through MCU films, we'll rewatch Iron Man 2 when we get to the end of it, and we'll just go like, want to watch the last hour of Endgame again? And we'll just throw the last hour on again. And every time, it is so good. When Captain America has the hammer, when the portals start opening, and then every little bit in that final sequence is just so good. It's so satisfying. It's so emotional. It's everything that you want from a third act of a comic book movie, except it's like the third act of 22 comic book movies all combined together. It is so good. Without question, top tier MCU. And it was soon followed up by Spider-Man Far From Home, a movie that has a lot of really fun elements inside of it, but also that let me down with a lot of the plot points. For me, this movie is enjoyable, but it is very flawed. And so all the humor as just kind of this high school road trip movie going to Europe, I have a fun with all of that stuff, but the central plot line, I don't understand how they moved forward with this plot and didn't notice the flaws in it. That Tony Stark left this dangerous technology to a high schooler that had been dead for 5 years. That's the plot of this movie. And once again, the villain is someone scorned by Tony Stark, even after Tony is dead. And the hero that saved half the universe, still the motivation for our villains are Tony Stark was a jerk as a boss. But the motivation, it just drags a movie that has so much fun in it down when I can't buy into the plot of the film. So it is enjoyable. There's a lot of flaws. Real quick before we dive into Phase 4, remember to join me down below in the comment section. Share your tier ranking of the MCU. How do you divide these movies up into different categories? Also remember, I got a link down below in the description to the tier maker that I actually use so you can make your own. If you share it on social media, tag me. I'll probably reshare some of them, like some of them. I'd love to see what you're thinking. Also, I've done some other tier rankings before, and you can check those out right up here, as well as in the playlist up here where I've got my other MCU rankings. And finally, we've made it to Phase 4 with Black Widow. Now, right off the bat, this is a movie that came out 5 years too late and feels kind of like the long-lost Phase 3 movie. If you set that aside, I think that this is a very enjoyable MCU film that does something just a little bit different. Once again, one of those things the MCU does well is make movies that feel like the MCU, but bring in different genres. This one being a bit of a spy film about this spy family. And so there's a dynamic in it that's just different from what we've seen before. I think there's some very cool action inside of it when it's more practical. When it gets spectacly CGI buildings falling out of the sky, that's not really my thing. But when it kind of relies on the practical stuff, I think it really cool action inside of the film. I love the dynamic of the family. Red Guardian has so many funny moments. The standout here is Florence Pugh, who outshined Black Widow in her own movie. And so for me, this is a movie that I don't know why they didn't do this as a phase 3 film. I don't know why they waited. It makes it feel a little bit strange. But if you can set aside the fact that the movie came out 5 years too late, this is the MCU knowing how to produce movies that are enjoyable. Safe, doesn't take a lot of risks, but it's just different enough and certainly enjoyable enough. Mid-tier for me. That'll bring us to ShangChi and the Legend of the Ten Rings. And once again, the MCU finds a way to bring in new influences. This one bringing in a bunch of Asian cinema, both kind of the Jackie Chan style action, as well as some of the like wire fu, like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It builds out this whole new set of mythology, what was kind of going on with the real Mandarin. Speaking of the real Mandarin, we get one of the better villains the MCU has given us, who's a character that truly has conflicting values inside of him of what he's trying to do, what he's willing to do. He's not really a good guy, but he's not fully a bad guy either in what he's trying to do. His motivations for many of his actions actually quite noble, the way he goes about them, quite villainous, and that makes him more compelling in a lot of ways. This is one for me that it's very enjoyable, but also an example of the way the MCU could be its own biggest enemy. I also felt like they put a few too many jokes in there, and they cut the tension at a few points in time, like in the third act, it cuts to a joke that was like, you broke the tension. Why did you do that? I don't know why you did that. And I feel like this movie would have been better with a lower budget. Like, I think the bus sequence isn't as exciting as the bus sequence in the movie Nobody. And I think this movie, if it dialed back some of the like excesses of MCU requirements for spectacle, dial that back and trust the choreography, the movie would have been even better. As is, very enjoyable, mid-tier. I think this one did have the potential to be great if they had just dialed back some of the MCU-isms. And that will finally bring us to Eternals, the latest MCU film, and maybe the most polarizing film in the entire MCU. A number of my movie critic friends went and saw it, and they declared it top tier MCU. Also right now, it is the MCU film with the lowest Rotten Tomatoes score. As for me, this might be the only MCU film where when I first watched it, I left the theater and I thought, I didn't like that movie. And then I watched it a second time and it just affirmed to me it's bottom tier for me. And I think why this is, it's interesting because so many people loved it and they loved its ambition. They loved that it's an MCU film that's actually exploring some deeper themes and telling this gigantic story with massive scope to it. For me, it just felt like they bit off more than they could chew. They tried to do so many things with so many characters that one movie simply couldn't sustain this much stuff and it crumbled under its own ambitions. So the characters felt underdeveloped to me. It felt like it was rushing through plot points in a way that in character arcs in ways that I didn't think they were developed right. The deviants were misused. It's like they had half of a character arc. I thought the morality as you moved into the third act was way too convoluted of like, do the heroes even want to save the Earth? That isn't a good question for your movie to be asking after you've saved mankind. If you have the hero of your story being like, did we even do the right thing about saving me saving mankind? I think that's a very confusing message that doesn't resonate with a lot of the audience, didn't resonate with me. I don't think any one thing in this movie really worked for me. And that's a really bad sign. So for me, unfortunately, as much as I can appreciate they tried something different, I appreciate that they took a risk. I still want them to take risks. This one did not pay off. The execution did not work. it's bottom tier for me. So there you have it. That's my tier ranking for the MCU. Remember, the link is down below in the description where you can fill out your own tier ranking. If you share it on social media and tag me, I'd love to check some of yours out. Also, I've done some other tier rankings. You can check those out right over there. I've also done some other MCU rankings. Quite a few, actually. You can check those out right over there. Thank you so much for watching, and keep talking movies too much.